Welcome to Airgun Academy, presented by Pyramyd Air, your online airgun resource. In this episode, I'm going to talk about selecting the right scope. But you know, we've already done a lot of episodes on scopes. Episode 18, Introduction to Scope Mounts, where we talked about scope bases. Episode 20, where we talked about how to use the trajectory of the airgun to sight in a scope. Today is just one more article about scopes. Now, the first thing you want to do is consider the fit of the scope to the rifle, and that means several things. It means when you hold the rifle up, can you mount the scope so that it's in the right position for your eye, so that you're holding the gun normally, not having to lean way forward because the scope is way forward, because that's the only place it could be mounted. This is a brake barrel. It needs a little clearance for the end of the barrel. So this scope may fit, but a longer scope may not. So when you select the right scope, there are a number of things you have to keep in mind. I've got another scope here that I want to talk about for just a moment. It's a little bitty guy, and I love it. It's called a bug buster. Isn't it nice? But when you select a scope like this, you may run into problems. You see this scope ring? The scope ring is just about as long as the scope tube. That means wherever that ring can fit on your gun is where that scope has to be. There's no forward and back for adjusting the scope for eye relief. Let's look at a different problem. Let's look at the Marauder, which is a very nice repeating PCP, but it has a big old magazine that sticks up right here. You see that? You see what I had to do to get this scope on this gun? I had to mount it on high mounts, and not any kind of high mounts. I had to use two-piece high mounts, because if I tried to use a one-piece mount, I would have run into the magazine. So consider the type of scope that you're putting on the gun, but also the gun itself, and does it have any pieces that get into the way of the scope being mounted. One-piece mounts are a lot less flexible than two-piece mounts that can be positioned in different places depending on your need. Another thing that a lot of air gunners are talking about these days is they want to get their scopes down low so they're very close to the bore. They're thinking that if they do that, they will have less of a problem with trajectory and with tilting the rifle from side to side, which is called cant. Well, the truth of the matter is, the savings that you'll get in that area are not worth the headaches. I use high mounts on most of my guns and I do just fine. Let me talk for a moment about reticles. The plain crosshairs are the most common reticle, but then you have the crosshairs that have the thick legs and then they get thinner in the center. We call those duplex crosshairs. Then you have the reticle that has dots along the lines. They can be along the horizontal line or on both lines. We call those Mil-dots because the dots themselves are one or more mils of angle wide. You can actually measure distances based on how much area those dots cover up, if you know what you're doing. And finally, we get the fancy trajectory estimation reticles that are used for ranging. Many firearms have scopes like that, but the problem with those is they're very specific to the type of gun that they're on and even the type of ammunition that's going to be fired. So I want to talk about scope magnification. Now, on this gun I have a 3 to 9. It's a variable. It'll magnify 3 times, or I can dial it all the way up to 9 times. This guy goes from 8 to 32. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, oh, give me 32. Yeah, you can see a blade of grass with 32 power. The problem is, which blade is it? So you dial it back to 8 power, and now you can see the lawn, and you can actually find out which blade of grass it is. So when you pick in power, don't always go for the high power. I do like variable scopes because they give me a choice, and I find out more often than not I'm setting them somewhere in the middle of the range, not all the way at the top end of the range, especially when I get out into the woods. Speaking of which, there's even a reticle for that. It's called an illuminated reticle. It's electrically powered and it lights up. For example, this scope has 36 colors and hues. Why would they have 36? Is it a sales gimmick? No. 14% of all males are colorblind. I'm one of them. I'm red-green colorblind, which is really bad because usually these illuminated reticles come in either red or green. But UTG scopes provide blues and purples and pinks, and I don't know what the names of the colors are, but they're colors other than red and green. You use these scopes and you use the variations of hues in the early morning light when you can't see anything but the image through the scope, or as it's getting almost dark, you see the animal and you can light up the reticle and you can see where it is. And the good news is, what if my batteries run out? Well, if your batteries run out, the reticle stays black like a normal reticle. In this episode, we've talked all about picking the right scope for your air gun. We talked about how important scope fit and eye relief are. They're vital. We talked about how scopes have to clear the various parts of your air gun, not just the barrel, but also the other parts of your air gun, and they allow you to load unimpeded. We talked about how one-piece rings are a lot less flexible than two-piece rings, and sometimes on some scopes you have to be worried about how long or short the scope tube is because it can't be used with those rings. We talked about how close the scope should be mounted to the bore of your gun. It sounds like a good thing, but really in practice it isn't that important. We talked about how much magnification you're probably going to need, and remember, sometimes less is more. We talked about the types of reticles that there are, and finally we talked about the illuminated reticle. A lot in this episode. Thanks for watching.